The temperature had already fallen past the point where numbers stop helping. At -42, sound behaved differently. Wood tightened, breath became visible and stayed that way, hanging longer than expected before breaking apart. The cabin stood alone in a clearing where the trees thinned, its roof carrying a weight of snow that never fully slid off, only compressed itself deeper into ice. Inside, a single lamp was already lit before dawn, its glow weak but deliberate. Someone was awake, not moving much, just awake enough to listen. The wind didn't howl, it pressed, a constant pressure against the walls, like a question that refused to be answered quickly. The man inside the cabin had learned long ago not to respond to that question all at once. He moved slowly, conserving heat the way other people conserve money. Every step was measured, every decision postponed until it could no longer be avoided. Outside, the road that once brought people here had been abandoned weeks earlier. Tracks had filled in, vehicles had turned back. Even the radio had gone quiet, except for the scheduled check-ins that no longer expected a reply. Everyone else had left before the cold settled this deeply. They left in stages, promising to return, promising to send someone, promising that staying was unnecessary. None of those promises were carried by the wind anymore. The man poured water from a metal pot into a cup and waited. Steam rose, then vanished, stolen immediately by the air. He didn't drink it, he watched. At these temperatures, watching mattered. Water that cooled too fast meant something else in the cabin might be cooling too fast as well. He placed the cup near the stove, adjusted a vent with bare fingers that stung on contact, and finally took a small sip. There were reasons to leave. He knew them all. He had helped list them for others. Frostbite that doesn't announce itself. Equipment that fails without warning. A body that no longer recovers the way it once did. None of that was new information. What remained was quieter. The knowledge that the cabin, once empty, would not simply wait. Pipes would split. The roof would sag. The generator, already temperamental, would seize for good. Some things only survive if someone stays with them through the worst part. He checked the door latch, even though he hadn't opened it. The metal was so cold, it sounded faintly when touched. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, not with color, but with absence of darkness. Another day was arriving without ceremony. The man pulled on his coat and stood still for a moment, listening to the cabin settle around him. He had made a decision, or perhaps he had been making it for weeks without saying it out loud. The cold did not care either way. It only waited to see what he would do next. By the time the light fully reached the clearing, the cabin had warmed only slightly, enough to keep the walls from cracking further, enough to let the man move without rushing. Routine mattered here. Not as comfort, but as structure. He fed the stove with 2 pieces of split wood, no more. Too much heat too fast could be as dangerous as none at all. He watched the flame take hold, then turned away before it grew too strong. He had been the one to lock up the other buildings before people left. The storage shed, the small workshop, the radio room that once carried voices from far away. Each door closed with the understanding that it might not be opened again until spring, if then. Staying behind had not been announced as a plan. It had emerged gradually, the way cold does, advancing inch by inch until retreat becomes complicated. His hands bore the evidence of years spent in places like this, skin thickened, nails uneven, small scars that never fully faded. He flexed his fingers near the stove, counting silently until sensation returned. Pain was useful. It meant something was still working. Numbness was what he watched for. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow lifted briefly from the ground, skimming the surface like a low cloud before settling again. The cabin creaked in response. He noted the sound, filed it away. New sounds were never ignored. They were warnings delivered without urgency. He checked the generator next. The machine was wrapped in insulation and stubbornness. It had coughed earlier in the week, a sound that lingered in his thoughts longer than he admitted. He opened the housing just enough to feel for vibration, then closed it again. Everything was about margins now, how close he could come to failure without crossing it. The radio remained silent. He adjusted the dial anyway, out of habit more than hope. When no voice came through, he didn't react. Silence had become part of the landscape. Still, he logged the time in a notebook, marking another check-in missed. The book was nearly full, pages thick with dates, temperatures, small observations that might never be read by anyone else. There were moments, usually in the early afternoon, when the light flattened and shadows disappeared. That doubt arrived uninvited. He would pause mid-task and consider what it would take to leave. The walk to the road, the wait, the possibility that no one would come. Those thoughts were acknowledged and then set aside. Doubt, like cold, was easier to manage if addressed early and briefly. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further. The stove demanded attention more often. The man responded without irritation. This was the agreement he had made. Even if no one else had signed it, he would stay attentive. The cabin would remain standing. What that cost him personally was something to be calculated later, if later arrived at all. The first real problem announced itself without drama. A change in smell. Barely noticeable at first, a thin edge beneath the familiar mix of wood smoke and oil. The man stopped moving and inhaled slowly, confirming what his body already knew. Fuel. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to matter. He traced the source to a line near the generator, stiffened by cold and stressed by constant use. The leak was small, almost respectful. At warmer temperatures, it might have waited weeks before becoming an issue. At -42, materials did not wait. They failed decisively, without apology. He shut the generator down and listened as the cabin fell into a deeper quiet. Without its low hum, the space felt larger and more exposed. Light dimmed immediately. He stood in the half-dark, considering options that all carried weight. Repairing the line meant working with bare metal outside, fingers exposed. Leaving the generator off meant relying entirely on the stove, limiting light and communication. Starting it again without fixing the problem was not an option he allowed himself to entertain. Time compressed. Decisions here always did. He gathered tools slowly, deliberately, as if speed might offend the process. Outside, the cold met him with physical force. His breath froze against his scarf. The metal of the generator housing burned through his gloves almost instantly. He worked anyway, counting movements, pausing often to bring his hands back to his body. Midway through the repair, the wind picked up again. Snow found its way into the smallest openings, melting briefly on warm surfaces before freezing harder than before. The man's shoulders tensed, not from fear, but from concentration. This was the moment people meant when they talked about risk. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet accumulation of small exposures. He thought briefly of the others who had left, of their backs as they walked away, heavy packs shifting with each step. He did not resent them. Leaving had been reasonable. Staying was simply another kind of responsibility, one that did not announce itself as bravery. When the line was finally sealed, he waited. Not for relief, but for confirmation. He restarted the generator and listened. The hum returned, steadier than before, or perhaps he was simply listening harder. He stayed outside longer than necessary, scanning the clearing, the trees, the sky that never quite turned blue at this time of year. Inside, warmth returned gradually. The man removed his gloves and examined his fingers. Pale, stiff, but responsive. He noted the time, the temperature, the repair. Another entry in the book. Another reminder that the margin had narrowed again. Night arrived early and without color. The cabin stood illuminated against the dark, a single point of resistance in a landscape that did not negotiate. The man prepared for the hours ahead, knowing that the most important part of the day was still waiting. Sometime after midnight, the stove faltered. Not fully, not yet, but enough to change the rhythm of the cabin. The man woke immediately, senses tuned by years of interrupted sleep. The flame had weakened, its sound irregular. He added wood and adjusted the damper, watching closely as the fire struggled back to balance. This was the decision he had been moving toward since the season began. The one no checklist could resolve. Fuel reserves were lower than planned. The repaired generator would need rest to avoid another failure. The cold outside showed no sign of easing. He could begin rationing more aggressively, stretching supplies at the cost of comfort and safety. Or he could attempt a brief trip to the secondary cache farther down the trail, a walk that had been manageable in better conditions. He sat on the edge of the bunk and waited for his breathing to slow. Decisions made in haste here tended to last longer than intended. The image of the trail formed in his mind, each landmark recalled with precision. The stand of birch, the bend where wind collected, the narrow bridge over frozen water. None of it had changed, but all of it would feel different now. By early morning, he had decided, not because it felt right, but because it felt necessary. He prepared methodically, layering clothing, securing a rope around his waist, checking his watch, though time mattered less than daylight. Before opening the door, he stood still, hand on the latch, acknowledging the risk without naming it. Outside, the cold closed around him immediately. Each breath was an effort. The trail was visible only because he remembered it. Snow erased details, leaving shapes and shadows that could deceive the eye. He moved steadily, resisting the urge to hurry, knowing that speed created heat only briefly and mistakes for much longer. At the cache, the lock resisted before yielding. He retrieved what he could carry, not everything available. Weight was another margin to manage. The return trip felt longer, the wind more insistent. By the time the cabin came back into view, his legs burned and his thoughts narrowed to simple instructions. Step, breathe, step. Inside again, he unloaded supplies and leaned against the wall until the room stopped spinning. The stove welcomed the fuel. The generator remained silent, given its rest. He drank water slowly, feeling it warm his chest. The decision had been executed. The consequences would unfold later. For now, the cabin held. The man remained awake, listening, understanding that the longest part of the night was not yet finished. Sleep came in fragments. The man rested when he could, waking often to check the stove, the temperature gauge, the sound of the wind against the walls. Each interruption was noted mentally, another data point in a body that had become its own instrument panel. Outside, the cold deepened further, pressing the world into stillness. At some point before dawn, the generator protested again. A brief stutter, then silence. He shut it down fully without hesitation. There would be no more attempts tonight. Light would be rationed. Heat would be prioritized. Communication would wait. The darkness inside the cabin felt heavier now, shaped by shadows that shifted with the flame. He moved carefully, avoiding unnecessary trips across the floor. Fatigue altered judgment as surely as cold. He reminded himself of this, silently, the way one might remind a child of rules already learned. Hours passed. The stove demanded constant attention, consuming fuel faster than he liked. He fed it sparingly, coaxing rather than commanding. Outside, the wind finally eased, replaced by a silence so complete it rang. In that quiet, the cabin seemed to breathe with him, expanding and contracting, holding together through shared effort. There were moments when doubt returned, sharper than before. He imagined what would happen if he stopped responding, how quickly the cold would reclaim the space, how the cabin would become just another shape under snow. Those thoughts were not indulged. They were acknowledged and set aside, like tools placed back on a shelf. Near morning, exhaustion settled in fully. His movements slowed, his thoughts repeated. This was the danger he respected most, not the cold itself, but the way it encouraged stillness. He countered it by standing, stretching, speaking aloud a few simple observations. The sound of his own voice anchored him in the present. When the first hint of light appeared at the window, it felt less like relief and more like confirmation. He had made it through another night, not because of strength or resolve, but because of attention paid consistently over time. The cabin stood, the fire burned, the man remained. Morning arrived thin and pale, the sky offering light without warmth. The temperature remained brutal, but it had stopped falling. The man noted this with quiet satisfaction. Not optimism, just acknowledgement. He restarted the generator briefly to send a short signal, then shut it down again. No reply came back, but the message existed now, carried outward into the cold. He cleaned the cabin slowly, restoring order where it had slipped during the night. Each task was familiar, grounding. The notebook received another entry. The pages were nearly full, but not finished. Neither was he. As the day progressed, he stepped outside to check the structure one more time. The roof held, the walls remained true. The clearing lay unchanged, snow smooth and unbroken. From a distance, the cabin looked small, almost insignificant. Up close, it carried the weight of care, of decisions made repeatedly in the same direction. He knew others would return eventually, or they wouldn't. That outcome was beyond his control. What remained within it was the choice to stay present, to meet each hour as it arrived, to keep something intact simply because it was his responsibility to do so. The cold would continue. It always did. And when it finally eased, the cabin would still be there, altered but standing. Evidence not of defiance, but of patience. Some people leave when survival becomes uncertain. Others remain, not because it is easier, but because leaving would mean abandoning what still needs care.